Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue, and this is the Church of Logic. Today we're going to talk about computability. I'm kind of excited to talk about this. It's kind of a cool subject. It's one I care a lot about. It seems on the surface that computability is sort of unrelated to logic. On the surface, it just seems like computer science is its own subject and doesn't necessarily have that much to do with logic. But it turns out that for very good reasons, the first pioneers of the mathematical theory of computability were actually logicians, and you'll see that there's reasons for this. And one of the biggest reasons is that computability somehow has to do with the phenomenon of undecidability, which I haven't really talked about yet, but is going to be the subject of several episodes. So I'm excited about that. Computability, on the face of it, is something probably a lot of you have intuition about. It's just everybody has computers. Computers are everywhere. We do everything with them. And I'm sure there are a lot of you that know at least the basics of programming and how to write code, or even how to do mental arithmetic. All that is indeed computation, and people already knew kind of the basics of this in 17th century. I mean, people were doing complex computations. There's some famous notes of Isaac Newton doing like multi-line computations. But the difference here, I think, is that really we want a mathematical theory about all the things that it is possible, theoretically, to compute. And having a clear mathematical definition of that is actually something that's really important, at least philosophically, because it allows you to talk about the limits of computation. And being able to talk about those limits is one of the crucial insights of modern 20th century logic, mathematical logic. And it's also kind of one of the founding principles of computer science. Like, understanding what we can't compute is one of the things you really gain from this mathematical insight into computations. And sometimes it's useful to determine what things we can compute, and using this mathematical theory can sometimes help that. But for the main part, the theory of computation is what are the limits of computation. What's kind of fascinating is that this idea is recent, right? It's from the 1930s, but at the time, logic was so ripe for this idea that essentially four people came up with this fundamental definition of what computation was, mathematically, at about the same time, really like a couple of years apart, maybe from 1930 to 1935 or 36. People independently came up with what I'm going to briefly talk about, four different definitions of computation, which are all equivalent. So really, the space was very ripe for this. The most famous is Turing's definition. So Turing tried to reason about what it meant to be able to compute something. And he had in his head this idea of a person sitting at a desk trying to apply rules and apply these rules to essentially write down an answer. And that answer was, a set of symbols. And what you could do, what these rules allowed you to do is read a current set of symbol that you had written down, a current symbol out of, this long tape of symbols, and decide based on that symbol and the current rule you were reading whether to change that symbol and then which new symbol to look at. And doing this, until either the instructions tell you to stop or just keep going forever. So he had the kind of the insight that this very, very simple setup of like, read a symbol, look at the rule, decide what to do, whether to change the symbol or not, and then use that decision whether to go, left or right on the tape, or you could arbitrarily jump to another symbol, at some space, but the rule has to explain which one. And he realized that this kind of simple setup actually was very powerful. Like you could define, addition, multiplication, all those basic things, but you could also define much more complicated steps, much more interesting things. He actually eventually came up with a little chess playing algorithm that was described in this way. But it was also clear that it seemed that like almost every rule-based way of determining an answer seemed to fall into this category pretty well. And again, we're going to talk about this more, but I'm just going to briefly mention some of these other people and how they came to this realm of defining computation. So Alonzo Church, who is basically the reason I named this podcast this way, he basically came up with a definition the same year as Turing, like a month or two apart. Unfortunately, he published a little bit later, so Turing got primality, but they're both pretty famous, so I'd say neither of them really got a worse deal, except of course Turing, for reasons that are much darker. So Church came up with this idea that, hey, computation is basically just manipulating symbols in a certain way. So this is similar to Church, but his setup had this very simple kind of rule where a program would just say, hey, take this other piece of the program and replace into the program. Like basically take a name like, X, and take this piece of program and replace it into X. And then that piece of program itself could also have this rule of like take something and replace this name by this thing. And that's kind of hard to describe without going into much more detail, but it turns out this is actually very, very rich. Like you can really do a lot of things just by this simple look at this thing, replace this name by this thing rule. And Emil Post, sadly, he for reasons that are again a little bit tragic, he didn't publish before Turing or Church. He published somewhat after, but it appears that he came up independently with these ideas, and actually a few years before, in the early 30s, he had this similar notion where you could look at a set of symbols, and there was a rule that sort of said, hey, if you see these symbols contiguously, replace those by these other symbols, and then start over. Like, look at all your rules, look at your symbols. If there's a rule that tells you to change this, this list of symbols into something else, then do it. And he also noticed that this was a very, very powerful system with very, extensive set of things you could compute with it. And kind of independently, but they all sort of, Turing showed that you could do a lot of things in this way. And he argued that, yes, this is a reasonable thing to define computation by. Like you can't do anything if you can't do it using one of these, one of these rule sets. And then Church came up with this other system, and he proved that his system and Turing's had the same expressiveness. Basically, everything you can compute using, Turing's rules, which, are now called Turing machines, and Church's system, which is now called, the Lambda calculus, those were all equivalent. And then after Emil Post came on the scene, he showed that that was equivalent to his system, and all these different ways of computation were equivalent. And this is kind of a reassuring thought, right? Saying, hey, we got the definition of computation right, because these very different systems that are all sort of trying to compute things in this kind of universal way, but in very different manners, they all happen to be equivalent. They can all exactly compute the same things. Now, I haven't really defined precisely what it means to compute the same thing, but intuitively you can see, right, what it would mean to take, the inputs from a Turing machine and translate them into the inputs to some other type of machine. As long as you know how to translate the symbols, you understand what it means for one computation to do the same thing as another kind of computation. So Gödel came on the scene. He had already published the incompleteness theorem, but it felt like something was missing from those theorems, and it felt like that missing piece was really connected to computability. So he was interested in this, and he was very compelled by this finding. Kurt Gödel and Jacques Herbrand, who's kind of one of the unsung heroes of logic, came up with yet another, an alternative way of doing things. And this one was much more in Gödel's style, based on arithmetic, where your basic rules, instead of talking about symbols, you talked about numbers. And the rules you would use to compute things about numbers were sort of like, hey, you have addition, you have multiplication, but you also can sort of define a rule to say, hey, do this operation, and repeat it until something happens. And a strong version of this rule is keep repeating this either forever or until one of these numbers becomes 0. And again, I'm not going into too much detail, but Gödel had this very strong insight that basically you can code symbols as numbers and vice versa. You can code numbers as symbols. Of course, we do that all the time. And you can, again, translate between these systems where you have things that operate on numbers, things that operate on programs, things that operate on abstract symbols, and yet another system that is equivalent to all these other systems. So all this happened within a course of a few years, where people were like, hey, we now know what we think computation is, and now we're going to use this insight to say some deep things about logic and about our ability as humans to solve certain mathematical problems. I'm going to talk about that next.